Do you like sports? Do you like art? What about science? Giraffes? Giraffe scientists that paint rugby games? It's all available on Audible, the biggest audiobook site with the largest selection of audiobooks this side of the inner solar system. No need to use your boring old eyes anymore. The ears are the future, my friend. Why, you're using them right now. So check out Audible and get your listen on. Go to www.readlearnlivepodcast.com/audible to start your 30-day free trial today.
That this was a time of American exceptionalism, and we have forgotten how much we achieved as a nation, that we were leading expeditions to Antarctica. This was the most exciting thing going. It was the great unknown. We were flying over the continent for the first time, and we have forgotten about the passion that all Americans had for this expedition.
Hello and welcome to Read, Learn, Live, the podcast about improving yourself through literature. I'm your acclaimed host, John Monaster, and I'd like to welcome you to episode 31, released on January 31. Never trust numbers. As always, if you have ideas for books you'd like to see featured, or have authors you want to put me in touch with, you can reach me at jon@readlearnlivepodcast.com. Today, I'm delighted to have the opportunity to speak with author Laurie Gwen Shapiro about her book, The Stowaway. Laurie Gwen Shapiro is a native of New York City's Lower East Side. She has most recently written articles for publications including The New Yorker, New York Magazine, The Daily Beast, Slate, Eon, Los Angeles Review of Books, and has her own history column focusing on unsung heroes for the forward. Shapiro is also a documentary filmmaker who won an Independent Spirit Award for directing IFC's Keep the River on Your Right, a modern cannibal tale, and an Emmy nomination for producing HBO's Finishing Heaven. The Stowaway is her first nonfiction book. I hope you enjoy the conversation as much as I did. All right, hello everyone, and welcome to the Read, Learn, Live podcast. My name is John Monaster. I'm your host, and I'm very excited today to be with Laurie Gwen Shapiro, author of The Stowaway. Laurie, say hello.
Hello, I'm very excited to be here as well.
Okay, good to know. The Stowaway, A Young Man's Extraordinary Adventures to Antarctica, is a exciting book, and I always like to kick things off by asking the author to summarize the book for us. Go for it.
Okay, well, this is a nonfiction book. A few people have asked me if it's a novel, but this is a story of a young man, 17 years old, just out of high school, who actually jumped into the Hudson River in 1928 to stow away to Antarctica with the first American expedition that was being run by then Commander Richard Byrd, who many Americans will know as Admiral Byrd. And this is the story of how he got there and then what became of him.
Yeah, and what a story. I always like to start off with some kind of process questions to learn more about what it was like to put the book together and write the book. And yeah, as you mentioned, it's a true story, but it really is written like a gripping narrative. I mean, there's just so much going on. You're transported to the locations, the sights and sounds and smells. So maybe talk a bit about what it was like taking kind of all this historical research that you did and turning it into a narrative. What was that like?
Well, for me, the kind of books that I enjoy the most are narrative nonfiction that unfold like novels. So that was always my goal. I have a background as a novelist. I was a young novelist in the late 90s, and I did a little chick lit when I was a little bit older. And now I wanted to do something with more gravitas. But I think what's important is that I also have experience as a documentary filmmaker. And I had the idea that if I went back to writing, I wasn't going to be writing wacky novels anymore. I wanted to write the kind of books I read in real life. So I wanted to write a serious nonfiction book that unfolded like a novel or one of those documentaries you see that's a great true story. So to me, this book is taking skill sets that I have from past parts of my life, my novel techniques, my research techniques as a documentarian, and storyteller techniques. And to me, it reads even like a documentary unfolding in a book as well. I tried to make it very visual. One of the things that's really interesting is that I spent 3 years researching this on my own. I'm not at a university. I'm working out of my house. But I was able to access quite a bit of the story from old newspapers, not just from the ones that I was able to find online and at microfiche, but I guess we'll talk about this in a little bit, but I was able to get primary sources from unexpected people.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I was just going to ask you about. I mean, you had this selected bibliography, which was amazing. I mean, you did so much research and so much work finding all this information, doing primary research, doing new information. You know, talk about that for a bit, including some of the people you found and interviewed. And then, you know, I'd love to hear about your trip to Antarctica, which is the ultimate primary research for the book.
Well, actually, the first thing that happened is that you need to know I wasn't setting out to write this book. Mm-hmm. This was happenstance. I wanted to write such a book, but I didn't know where to turn. What I was doing in the interim, preparing for the kind of nonfiction book that I wanted to write, was just practicing craft. And I was writing one story, and I saw this tiny mention of a stowaway connected to a church, a Polish church in New York City from 1928, and who had a parade of 500 kids coming, marching from Tompkins Square in the East Village to City Hall to meet the returning teen stowaway and I just said, what? Yeah. And I sort of stopped everything that I was doing. And I got as far as I could at first. I found one or two things in the New York Times, but his last name is Gawronski, and people could not handle a long Polish name, and I guessed that they might have misspelled it, which was a great guess because other things started to emerge. But then I went to the library and got out microfiche on things I couldn't get from online sources, and I still didn't feel I had enough. And what I did is I made a spreadsheet, a crazy spreadsheet of all the Gawronskis and Gawronskis on the Eastern Seaboard, and I started to call them after a giant cup of coffee. And I would call and I would say, hi, I'm a writer, and are you possibly descended from a teen stowaway who swam across the Hudson River in 1928 and joined Admiral Byrd's expedition to Antarctica? And it was like, click. A lot of hang-ups. And I just started laughing, but I felt that as a documentarian, I knew one way to a great story is to have true access and not just to regurgitate what you see in a newspaper. And I finally, about the 19th call, reached a name, that had a similar name, and a woman answered, and she had a heavy accent, and I knew that Billy Gawronski, my protagonist, my stowaway in this book, was born in 1910 in New York City, and that his children wouldn't have probably had accents. But I went through my spiel instead of hanging up, and I heard very softly, that was my husband. And I had a chill that went down my spine, and I honestly knew it was going to be a book at that moment, but she then added, I've been waiting for someone to call. I have everything. And I mean, she had everything. I was up in Maine in 3 days, and she not only now did I have my articles that I had found, but she had scrapbooks that he had kept before he went to Antarctica, and scrapbooks that his parents, who were furious with him but eventually came aboard, kept. And then I had other sources that I was able to tap into. I had his high school yearbook. I had newspapers from his high school. I had his shipping records. I knew I was talking to his wife. That was the craziest thing that ever happened to me. Yeah. But without his widow's active participation in my research, I don't know if I could have told the story in the way that I did.
And you went to Antarctica.
Well, once I had a lot of the stories about him, I still didn't feel like I had the authority to tell the story. I'm living in New York City. I'm a mom hanging out in the laundry room. Who am I to tackle Antarctic
Yeah.
history? And I was very, very lucky to secure a pretty decent book deal with Simon Schuster. Not something that would make you envious, but enough to like at least get a ticket to Antarctica. And I felt like that was a great use of my money because I didn't just want to write about it from clippings. I wanted to have the experience of stepping foot in the same places that my nonfiction protagonist had stepped foot. And remember, he's going from Delancey Street in the Lower East Side to Antarctica, and I live on the Lower East Side. And where I wanted to go was not the peninsula that many Americans travel to from Argentina, but to the Ross Sea, which I left from New Zealand. It's very hard to get on those expeditions, and it's much colder. And I started to see Antarctica the way he would have seen it on a ship, because my ship left from the bottom of New Zealand. There was a Starbucks at the bottom of the last
one. Yeah.
The last one was like the last thing I did was had a coffee, but that was literally before. That was the last place you could. There's a Starbucks. It's the southernmost town in the southern hemisphere. And we left on a ship that took over a week to get to Antarctica. And then when we got there, you would start to see the things that my protagonist and his shipmates would have seen, because not much has changed, obviously, in Antarctica. So I saw the penguins in the order that he would have seen them, the very cute little Adelie penguins. And then I would see the emperor penguins, which everyone is aware of from Disney movies and things like that. But then we would see the whales and the waves, and I started to really like have a connection to him, not just as a historical subject, but I felt like I was reliving his journey. Mm-hmm. And one thing that you don't think about by going to these places, you pick up details that you couldn't have possibly guessed. And I'll give you an example. When I was near the penguin landings, because, I was on a very high-end expedition with 60 people. So this was not a American mission. This was a paid-for thing. I was by the engine room in a triple, but I was on the ship.
Yeah, you made it.
But I couldn't have imagined the smell, for example, of penguin guano, penguin poop.
Yeah.
And how that was overwhelming, and to see dead penguins while you see the live ones. I couldn't have imagined the light, because even though we were there in the summer, which is American winter, it wasn't going to be 24 hours of light yet. There was still a sunset, a brief one, and we were there for that. And it was just the most gorgeous colors, and things like that went into the book. And I think that I didn't put my own journey in, because I felt this was a very crazy big story to begin with. But I feel like it permeated the book. Hopefully, it has. Hopefully, I'm correct about that.
I think so. What was one of the hardest parts or hardest things about putting the book together? About making this all into a coherent story, putting the chapters together?
I think I got some pretty good advice from someone who had done nonfiction books before. Now, remember, this is my first nonfiction book. So I wasn't going to try to reinvent the wheel. I just wanted to get through it.
Right.
But I knew I had a great story. I knew I had great characters. I knew I had a great access. So I had all the ingredients for a good book. And so this very seasoned writer who actually... I was talking to in a coffee shop I met to try to pick his brains and say, how would you approach this? He said, for this book, this is such a great story, just tell it straight. Tell it from beginning to end. And once I was able to do that, it was easy to sort of organize it, because I just started in the beginning. Well, I started with the prologue, which is a very sexy way in, I think, to get the most exciting moment for 2 pages, and then you start. Right. You go back a little bit. But I started from when his parents arrived from the Austro-Hungarian Empire, his Polish Catholic parents, and the immigrants, and a little bit of his experience as a young man, and how he got his swimming skills from being a Polish Falcon, which was a group of immigrant Poles that were keeping their skills up in case Poland became a nation again, which of course it did. And then I went into 1928, and the bulk of the book, although it goes further than 1930, is the expedition from 1928 to 1930. And I told it straight. I told it in the order unfolded, and I think that that is something that a lot of writers shy away from, just telling a story and not having to write the great American book. And just, I mean, readers really, I believe, I mean, I'm a big reader. I enjoy a great told story, whether it's fiction or nonfiction.
Yeah, me too.
I'm glad. I love, and Billy was a reader too.
Yeah.
That's something that we can talk about because he was a high school student. He was going to Textile High in Manhattan, which was sort of a public high school for arty kids. And he wasn't the best sitter. He was a Gestalt learner that, I mean, it reminds me of so many kids today in this overstimulated generation, but he just learned by seeing and doing. And I think that but what he was really loving was he had a real affinity for polar stories, true stories. And he read as much as he could, and the librarians knew him. And they saved anything from the North Pole, South Pole, but especially with Commander Richard Byrd, who was his hero. And he had quite a few books out. He was, at that time, the most famous American. 1926 was his North Pole expedition. We didn't hear about Charles Lindbergh until 27. There was a ticker tape parade for him in 26 that his father wouldn't let him go to. But in 27, Byrd lost to Lindbergh, and they gave him another ticker tape parade just for losing. This was the era of ticker tape parades. And then in 1928, he embarked on his trip to the South Pole to be part of the expedition that will be the first to fly over the South Pole. That was a big thing because the former expeditions from Europe had been men walking through the ice, and this was the age of aviation. Yeah. And that is one of the reasons that Billy actually undertook this, is because he was a reader. And he didn't want to just read adventures, he wanted to live them. And so to me, this was like that's one of the reasons I sort of approached it like a Jack London novel, you know, like even though it's nonfiction. But every single sentence of this book is absolutely true. Even the dialogue that I've picked up are from his own interviews from that time or from speeches. I haven't made up one word of dialogue, and which is, how do you put dialogue in a nonfiction book? Well, that's how. You find old interviews. And you find anything you can that has his voice. He wrote a couple of speeches and gave an interview or two to people who were extremely interested in his background. Yeah,
which was, I feel like, almost everyone by the time this story wrapped up. Was there anything that was particularly inspiring or inspired you while you were putting the book together?
I think originally I was grabbed by the fact that here was a kid whose father was in the upholstery business, and he didn't want to live a life of doom in the upholstery business. And I'm from the Lower East Side. That's where my immigrant grandparents were from. I still live in that historic area. But I think originally it was this story amused me, and I thought, oh, I want to follow in his tracks. But I think as I went on, what really surprised me was what happens to these very, very famous men after the Great Depression hits. This expedition, the first American expedition to Antarctica, was 1928 to 1930. And what happens in 1929? The Great Depression that starts, the stock market crash. But they were not really that affected because they were still heroes when they came back in 1930. There was a ticker tape parade for them. But people started to care less about the hijinks of the 1920s, and all the amusing anecdotes and things that people were cheering on was less important. And what really got me was what happened to these men in the 1930s. That famous men, including the captains of the ship, you know, were on the breadline and desperate for work, desperate for food. And I realized that this was truly something that I hadn't expected to connect to. this sort of how his social class affected his journey, and the other men on the trip, who was better off during the Depression, who wasn't, and where your social economic status interplayed with that. All of that was new to me, and it was quite fascinating, and it was very different than going to Antarctica and ogling the penguins.
Right.
It was emotional because as I said, I'm the child of 4 immigrant grandparents, and I realized that my grandparents suffered through the Depression, and I really connected emotionally to this story because of that.
Yeah. Well, let's get into the book, because we started talking there about everything that was happening, and kind of just from the beginning, it seemed to me that Billy was really methodical, and he sort of figured out that he wanted to get on board this ship. You kind of talk a bit of, like you were saying, he was at Textile High, he was doing all this stuff. He had his dad was in the interior design business, interior decorating, but Billy was like, this is what I want to do. I've been reading these books, I want to get on the ship. And he kind of figured it out. He had a whole plan. He showed up and picked out a spot. He did all the stuff, but at the same time, he didn't really plan too much outside of that. Like you mentioned in the book, he had like a sandwich, but no idea what was going to happen food-wise after or anything. He just even, it turns out there were other stowaways, and they brought luggage with them. And Billy just showed up.
He just showed up, and he actually is, as your readers will find out. What's amusing about him is that he was a serial stowaway. It wasn't just one attempt. It wasn't just 2 attempts. It wasn't just 3 attempts. Yeah. And he still didn't bring enough food and clothes. But what he did bring was his unbelievable determination to make this happen. He firmly believed in his heart that at one point Byrd, again, one of the most famous men in America, would actually cave.
Yeah.
That was his only plan, was that if he could appeal to Byrd, even though Byrd rejected him the first time again. Yeah. Eventually, Billy was no idiot.
Yeah. Well, and that's actually something I wanted to ask about. He really displayed a remarkable amount of grit, and determination and focus. And he just, like you said, he didn't take no for an answer. He kept trying. He pushed, and eventually he made it. And it's just stunning because as you describe in the book, tens of thousands of kids from all over the country tried to get on this expedition.
Right there. Actually, so just so you know, there were 2 main ships that were leaving from New York. There was the City of New York, which was the flagship. It was very romantic. It was a 4-masted barkentine from the late 1880s. And this was selected in part to get that spirit alive in the modern world of 1920s Americans. And the captain selected for the flagship was Captain Melville. That was no accident. The Byrd knew what he was doing to get people in a frenzy. And Melville was actually the author Melville's second cousin. Then there was the supply ship, which was docked by Gowanus Canal in Brooklyn, and that was not a romantic ship. And then there were 2 whaling ships that were going to be met in Los Angeles after they were coming down from Los Angeles. They had to, back then the ships went from New York down the eastern seaboard, the flagship and the supply ship through the Panama Canal. And then there was the whaling ships that had 100 dogs coming down and joining them. Those ships were not owned by Byrd's expedition. But what was amazing was just how many times Billy tried to get away with this. And I can't even express to you that how amused the members of the expedition were.
In thinking about all this, the grit, focus, determination, and he, like we were saying, he was like, I need to get on this ship. He didn't worry about food or clothes or anything. So, I mean, what made him such a special kid? How was he able to do all this when tens of thousands of other kids weren't?
So you have to know, of the ships going, most of the people going, it was a combination of sailors and scientists. This
Mm-hmm.
was a scientific expedition to Antarctica. It was really an expedition to secure Bird's legacy, but it ended up being a scientific expedition that we should be thankful for now in 2017. But 70,000, some people say 40,000, 50,000, 70,000 people applied for the 60 to 70 spots on this trip. And there was an application, and his father would not let him apply because he was under 18. But it's not like he would have gotten anywhere even if he did apply,
Yeah.
high school student. But what was amazing, they had sacks full of mail, just people applying, and not just men and boys, but women and girls. It was the time of Amelia Earhart and liberation, and women now had the vote. But they weren't going to take any women. But what made him special was that he felt in all his heart that if he just kept showing Bird what his determination was, that would somehow work. None of his family believed him, except surprisingly his grandmother, his Polish grandmother, who spoke very little English. And hilariously, I found out through another source, a living source of his, that his grandmother had a crystal ball. She had come over from the old country, and she had all these amulets, and she gave him the Virgin Mary to wear on his neck, and that is actually what he wore around his neck when he swam into the river and all through his trip. But she told him that I could see in the crystal ball that you're going to Antarctica. And he thought that was very funny, and he was just humoring her. But I always thought that was a great little detail. And I'll tell you how I got that bit, which is the other shocking source on this story is that I had thought both of his sons from his first marriage were dead. They had had a terrible connection to drugs in the 60s and 70s and supposedly died in jail. He had a terrible first marriage. And this widow was an older woman, but she was 20 years younger, which is one of the reasons she's alive. And she thought that the two sons were dead. And one day a Google alert went off with the same name, William Gawronski. And I looked to see what it was. I was terrified someone had stolen my story. And there was a picture of a man moving jails. And he looked just like my William Gawronski as an older man, but it said 2015. And it turned out that this was one of his sons was still alive in jail. And that was a frantic search to how can I connect to him. And I finally got permission to go to a maximum security prison in Florida. And he's actually was someone who had done drugs about 20 years ago and hasn't had any drugs. And they have very long sentences. And he turned out to be this amazing source. His stepmother had who was Billy's widow, had no idea he was alive. And everything he said checked out. He gave me very specific details that I would check with his widow. I would check with experts. And he was the one that told me about the crystal ball. And then his widow was shocked that I knew about how did you know about the crystal ball? So it was really neat to have not just one living source from a 1928 tale, but two.
Yeah.
His son, who had a different connection to his father and could give more of a feeling of what he was like when he's not a romantic partner.
Right, which is very different. So
yes,
that's a great find, and another journey that you undertook
yes.
to go visit a maximum security prison and talk to somebody there. One thing that I wanted to pick up on, you mentioned kind of in the middle of that they sort of weren't going to take any women on, even though that a lot of women applied. And you kind of made clear in the book there wasn't any room for them in the expedition. I guess do you have a sense of what the environment was like for women who wanted to be scientists or explorers at that time? And, how do you think the story of the book would have changed if Billy were a girl?
Well, it's really interesting. One of my prime places for research was Ohio State University, where the Bird archives are, which is an amazing place if anyone can ever get there. Bird was convinced he was going to be in the public's mind forever, which of course has slipped out of our mind. But there's sort of a football field size archive of his 4 expeditions. He kept everything. And there have been people who have used the archive, of course, but nobody was looking for the stowaway file. And so I was able to find not only Billy Gawronski's file, but the people who applied. And I I was going through the files with the librarian, and many of the people who had written about birds expeditions in the past were men, and didn't actually pull out a file of the women that had applied. And I went through many, many letters. And one of the letters I put into the book, a little tiny excerpt, it was a 4-page letter. It was a girl, a 14-year-old girl that sounded just like Billy, what she wanted and how she wanted to get on. And please take me with me. And I'm a tomboy. And she just was the same spunk, but there was no way that anything was going to happen to her. I actually traced her down. I mean, a lot of these stories had to get cut because it's not the story of the girl that wanted to stow away. She didn't go. But it was fascinating to know that even though she became a mother and she had 3 kids, at an eventual point in her retirement, she just went on a barge ship around the world. She's never stopped wanting to have the adventure that she wanted as a young girl, but she was blocked from those adventures. And it reminds me of my own mother and what issues she faced as a writer when she was younger, and how many opportunities I can have in a new time. And I think that was so interesting to me. Actually, at the same time, in the 1920s, there were surprisingly a lot of girl stowaways. There was a bit of a stowaway craze. Before the 1920s, people were stowing away to get to America, to get citizenship for the most part, or to get places. After the 1920s and the 1930s, they're looking for work. They're hobos and they're riding the rails. Those are the kind of stowaways. But 1920s is like really akin to flagpole sitting and buildering, which is climbing tall skyscrapers. These kids would use it the way that we would use Instagram to try to go viral, or YouTube. And I recently wrote an article to accompany the publicity of this called The Stowaway Craze for The New Yorker. And one of the things I found was that half the kids that were in the news at that point were girls. And one of them was a girl who would use it as a passport to get a film deal. Like, I'm stowing away, and she had she was an actress. I mean, that's how people were using it. But you could see what's really neat is in the 1920s, there was a real feminist push. But in Antarctica, they weren't going to take any women or girls. They didn't think it was safe. And then there was some really sexist journalists that would say, made fun of the girls and women applying. And it was interesting to read because most of the material on this expedition was written in the early 30s. There were quite a few book deals for all the members of the expedition. They were not allowed to talk badly about Byrd in order to get permission to write their books. But what's interesting is time gives you privileges as a historian. And I could see things that none of them would have seen when they were alive. And even later books that came out in the 1950s, when there was a nostalgia for these Antarctic expeditions, there were sexist, racist. There's a lot of racism at that time, too.
Yeah, that's definitely something that was talked about a lot in the book. I think one of the other stowaways was black, and I think there was a Jewish person on the crew.
It's like
and
the
that
start
was
of a joke. Deal. It's like the Polish Catholic and black and a Jewish kid stowaway to Antarctica. But it was amazing how they were all covered in the press. First of all, without giving away the story too much, what's so interesting is this is early on in the book. They're all caught on the flagship. And each stowaway became the hero of their particular ethnic press. So there was, the Polish stowaway kid. Then the Jewish press in Yiddish was covering the kid that came with a suitcase and extra underwear. And there was Macy's ads like, be prepared like the stowaway. That was Jack Solowitz, who was another stowaway. Then there's Robert White Lanier, and he was black, and he wanted to be the first black person to go to Antarctica. And the way he was treated was so different in the black press. It was a very strong national black press, as opposed to the general press. And the New York Times even had on their articles that they coaxed him out with watermelon. And I'm reading this, in 2000, like in the 2016 or 15, whenever I'm reading it, because now it's 2018. And I was shocked. I mean, there were just horrible things being said about him. And you, again, have the privilege of time to understand things that might not have been understood then. I mean, the New York Times was printing stuff like watermelon was used to draw him out. How crazy is that?
Yeah.
How offensive.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, let's talk about the media for a second, because I think that's just a crucial part of the story of the book. Is like the whole, like you said, Bird kept everything. There was a rush to document everything. I think there was National Geographic people that were on the trip.
There was a team from Paramount Pictures. The reason he wanted to document it was, again, this was secretly his quest to have legacy. Mm-hmm. When he went to the North Pole, and he was not really the pilot, he was more of the navigator. People think he was the pilot. So he brings a ship with dogs and a plane, and he supposedly flies over the North Pole. He may or may not have fudged his coordinates, but right away people were doubting it because there was no proof. So even in the Explorers Club, they were wondering out loud, did he actually really fly over the North Pole? But he didn't document it. Then he thought, well, he's going to get glory flying over the Atlantic with his, as a navigator with a pilot, and win the Orteig Prize, which of course his plane breaks down and some upstart named Charles Lindbergh comes out of nowhere and wins it. And so he was very gracious to him, but it must have really stung. I mean, that ticker tape parade is still the biggest ticker tape parade of all time, and nothing will ever top it. But Bird was someone who thought, well, what's my legacy? And he thought of the South Pole as a way to get some legacy. The first to fly over the South Pole. Someone had already reached the South Pole, but that was a different era. That was Amundsen from Norway in 1911. He had walked there beating out Robert Falcon Scott. But Americans were not aware of Antarctica. We just didn't bother with it. It was a European thing. And he really put Antarctica on the map for Americans. Like, they suddenly paid attention. And what's interesting, we talk about the media, not only did we have so many newspapers, I mean, even in New York alone, there were over 24 newspapers coming out every day. It's crazy what was, that's where people were getting a lot of their information. But there was also a new technology that didn't exist in the heroic age of Amundsen and Scott and Shackleton. There was this was the age of radio as well as the age of aviation, and Americans and then part of the world as well could listen. I mean, Bird took Americans right to Antarctica. Now we're talking on an audio format. Now it wouldn't have been so dissimilar. It seemed very modern then. They certainly, but what he also did is he said, I'm not hedging any bets. He got a film crew, a documentary crew, which was 2 people from Paramount. And there is a movie that anyone listening to this could actually just look for free on YouTube. It's called With Bird at the South Pole. And to this date, it came out in 1930. It is somewhat silent, but it has a lot of, a little bit of narration. But it won the Oscar for cinematography. And as I was saying, to this date, it's the only documentary to have won for cinematography. And Billy is not listed as one of the characters, but I, as his historian, as his biographer, I recognized him right away in one of the scenes, which was amazing. I mean, again, he wasn't the main character on this trip. Bird was, and all the famous scientists, and he was the stowaway kid, and he was very lucky. I mean, to be there. There was also a Boy Scout that was selected, and that was another crazy asterisk to the story. There were 800,000 Boy Scouts in America. They all wanted to go on this trip, and Bird was trying to mimic what had happened with Shackleton, and where he got a Bird Scout to go, and that was great press, and he was going to get the American Scout. and sort of a ringer one. His name was Paul Seipel, and he had the most badges of any Boy Scout in America. He was not much of a boy. He was 19 years old, and he was 6'4", but he had 54 badges, including taxidermy. And so there was sort of this little rivalry between the Boy Scout and the Stowaway, who was going to get in the movies, who was going to get to winter over. But that actually was a very good choice of Boy Scout, because Paul Seipel, to anyone who knows about Antarctica, went on to become probably the most important person in American Antarctica history besides Byrd. And he was the lead scientist on later expeditions. And he this is a bit of trivia, but he invented the term wind chill factor. But Byrd made a good choice.
Yeah. Antarctica seems like a place where you'd invent wind chill factor.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I just want to second that. I actually went on YouTube and watched a chunk of that movie, and it's actually really interesting, and especially helps bring the book to life after you read about everything, especially the part when they're there, and you can kind of watch and be like, wow, like, okay, this is them like trying to dig up the ice and actually deal with, we have to create a little a place for us to live over the
And
over
it was
the
actually
winter.
the name of the place. They chose the name Little America, and they built a little village on ice with the American flag. How do you think that went down in America? This was huge.
Yeah.
A town in Antarctica, and they built tunnels for the dogs to live. And the big deal was who was going to get to overwinter. It was a little bit like Survivor, like the real winners were going to get to overwinter there. But everybody on the expeditions, including Billy, built the town. There was luxurious furniture. There was a full library. There was a gymnasium. It was kind of crazy when you think about it. It's since fallen. I mean, this was on the Ross Ice Barrier, which is now called the Ross Ice Shelf. This was not actually. This was where they built a Little America. Byrd was advised by Amundsen, who had actually, traveled there in 1911, who died right before this expedition, but was alive to advise him. That's where you should build. I don't think that ice shelf is going to fall apart. And the pictures of it are kind of extraordinary, but the ice from there has calved off into the ocean. And even if you wanted to try to find it, actually, when I was on a ship going to Antarctica, there was a GPS, and they had in the water where the site of Little America was. And I took a picture of that, which was kind of neat. But it doesn't exist. Even the site doesn't exist. But the Ross Ice Shelf is certainly still an amazing sight to behold. And it's a mile high of ice, and it's just so overwhelming. But everybody who was an Antarctica buff back then knew where the Ross ice shelf was. Again, they called it the Ross Ice Barrier, but nobody knows that now. We don't think, because now we don't, that's not how we get to Antarctica. We don't, the people that are going to McMurdo, the American station, or every country has their own station, but they go by airplane.
Yeah, they take the easy way.
Yeah.
So I want to go back a bit to the beginning. I mean, so interestingly, the beginning of the book is a lot about Billy's life. And like you said, you're sort of his, unofficial biographer, right? I think his book was very interesting because it didn't just jump you right into Antarctica and trying to figure out who are all these people and what's going on. You took the time to explain a bit, and you talked a lot about, Billy and his background and what, was doing, his family and everything. So, how did you get to that point, where you decided, I really want to focus on Billy and not just what happened during those few months?
Well, this just isn't the all-American kid that's jumping into the river trying to get there. This is a kid who's a first-generation Polish Catholic kid. Mm-hmm. The Poles were extremely discriminated against, Catholics as well. And he was having the immigrant experience. He had grown up in tenements. His parents had high hopes for him to join the upholstery business. He was getting to go to college, to Cooper Union, which is a free college here in New York, which is very prestigious, to study design. And it was expected that he would join his dad. And I thought that was amazing. I mean, my parents were both college educated. All of my aunts and uncles are, but my grandparents were straight out of the books in what they look like, for the old immigrants. My grandmother was my babysitter. I have very old parents, so my grandmother was from the the 1880s, and she would. I mean, it was the age divide between us was extraordinary, but. So that would be the same time that his grandparents were.
Yeah.
And I just realized that this is an immigrant tale. To me, I have to say, I also have a passion for New York history. And many people are describing this as an Antarctica tale. But I also see this as a true New York story. I love the fact that this starts out in the Lower East Side? What? Isn't that where everybody's got like the push carts? I mean, what? Wait, Antarctica? Where's that coming from?
Yeah.
And I just love the connection that I can make, even though I'm a secular Jewish person. I'm not religious at all, and I'm not Catholic. I did have that emotional connection to being the grandchild of people from the old country. And I could understand the expectations. When my parents were younger, there was no messing around and, doing adventures. Your parents worked hard so you could go to college and have the opportunities that they didn't have, and you paid them back in their old age. And I think that my mother had many dreams and my father had many dreams, but the main thing was to provide a steady income. And they also were very small children going through the Depression, and that scars a lot of the older Americans that are still alive that went through that. Now, of course, I don't think about my privilege. I think of myself as being, I'm from the Lower East Side. I'm not coming from this old moneyed family. But you know what? I've gone to private school when I was younger. I went to a very prestigious, specialized public high school. I went to a private college. I've had privileges just growing up in New York City that I didn't even think about until I was writing this. And I thought, what amount of pressure was on him to provide for his parents? And here he is messing up Cooper Union acceptance, free college. I mean, it's so hard to get to. It's one of the hardest colleges to get into, even more so than Harvard, because it's 4 years paid education. And he's jumping into the river. How angry must his parents have been until they started to see that there was maybe a path for him with all the publicity that suddenly emerged.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a core conflict that you set up, at the beginning of the book. His parents, Francesca and Rudy, and there's conflict between them that you talk about at the beginning, and then conflict between them and Billy, and kind of the family business that Rudy was running was this interior decoration thing, and he really wanted his son to join and go to.
And they were doing well in the 1920s.
Yeah, he was working for like movie stars and stuff.
Yeah, he moved his family to Bayside, Queens, which a lot of Americans might not think of as the most glamorous address, but in 1920s, it certainly was. It was where the silent film stars were. There started to be an exodus to Hollywood, but many of the most famous people that we can still, rattle off their names today as the silent film stars, including W.C. Fields and other people who obviously wasn't always silent, but Gloria Swanson. I mean, they all lived in Bayside. Gloria Swanson. Some of them were moving, but his dream was that he was going to take his upholstery business and be the upholsterer to the stars. Now, when they started to go to Hollywood, he told his wife they didn't make a mistake because they weren't in the film business, and there were rich people in Bayside where all these mansions were, and rich people still need upholstery work done.
Yeah. But Billy was just so not having it. This was just like he has these, he reads all these books about exploring and adventure. He has these high-minded ideas, and he's just like, it just didn't work between them. And so Rudy really pushed back on that. And, he
actually got him at one point. Bird agrees to take him. Just then, Billy's arrested. His father put out a warrant for his arrest.
Right. He finally got. This was was it like Virginia or something?
Virginia. That's another story. But he not only did he go into some ships, he hitchhiked and told people he was a bottle washer on the expedition, and people bought his story. And he got himself to where the supply ship was landing again off the coast of Virginia. I think that was one of the moments that changed his course, because even the seasoned salts, that had been on other expeditions, were laughing hysterically. Like, how could this guy be here? And even Bird, when told that Billy had arrived again, just burst out laughing. I mean, I think they liked him. And one thing about Richard Bird that's very important to understand is that he's not. I mean, the Shackleton expeditions and the Scott, they're all very, very exciting. Byrd was like very protective of his men. No one ever got hurt. No one ever got lost on his expeditions. And he did have a very big narcissistic streak, but he was also very smart. And he basically wanted everyone that was joining the expedition to get along with each other. He wasn't going to pick somebody that was a troublemaker. And when he could see that everyone on the cruise were cheering on the Stowaway themselves, that was a real turning point for him. And he happened to be in Virginia sitting in a chair next to his brother, which doesn't seem like a big deal, but his brother is the governor of Virginia. This is the Byrds of Virginia. And his brother, from an old newspaper account that I found, was talking in front of a reporter and said, there's great value in that Stowaway. And this whole expedition was not paid by the American government. It was all promotion and publicity. And that's the moment that Billy's fate changed, when they realized, hey, not only do the Americans like him, but the people on this trip love him. And that was, I believe, the reason why he was asked, because he made everybody, feel good. He was a real fast-talking New York kid, funny, but he was not a mean child, and he was a truant, but not really a truant. He was a reader. How many readers are real truants?
Yeah. He finally gets on, and he finally goes, and he just starts to have these incredible adventures, and it's just amazing how we shift in the book from hearing about his life growing up in New York and dealing with just typical big city high school kid, and now he's,
going through the Panama Canal.
Going through the Panama Canal,
then
going
to
through
Tahiti.
Yeah.
And this was an arty kid. I mean, so he went to a very progressive high school. I mean, they read the Tender is the Night, and the reading F. Scott Fitzgerald. They had art classes with nudes. And his teachers, I actually got this is one of the advantages of finding the widow, is I got curriculums for the school. I could see what classes he was taking. And one of the things that they were doing was studying Gauguin. And, he's loving the fact that he's not just, is he living the life of one of his books, but he's in a painting as well. And he was not an innocent guy, like he loved girls. He was one of the sailors wrote a description of him as like, flapper chasing, loud mouth, funny. And you kind of get a picture of him, and some of his letters that I have read, I copied them from his widow, were hilarious because they were letters to his dad, not to let his mom know what a great time he was having in Tahiti. And I got the sense also when he was in Panama, where all the sailors went off with prostitutes. I don't know if he saw a prostitute, but I have a feeling that, he's with sailors and they're at sea, and he's 17. Now he's 18. I think he had a great time.
Yeah.
That might not be in the YA version.
Fair enough.
If there's one.
Yeah. So he eventually, they go to New Zealand, and they have a whole bunch of stuff happens there. I mean, but eventually they make it to Antarctica, and he is just blown away. And he's seeing, like you said, he's seeing the penguins and seals.
And he was a great penguin chaser because he had this
is one of his key jobs, right?
Yeah, well, when he was in 1925, so 3 years before the expedition, he was actually in the papers for training his dog Tootsie to ride a milkman's horse. I mean, he had a real gift with animals. He had pet rats, he kept bees, and Byrd could see this because there were 100 dogs on this trip, and there was a cat named Eleanor that stowed away at the last minute from Brooklyn, and he was very close to the cat too. He missed his Tootsie back in New York, but Byrd saw his energy. And one of the things that's really funny is that they were trying to bring penguins back for the Bronx Zoo and the London Zoo. That was one of the missions as well. And that happens on a later expedition because all these poor penguins kept dying. But Billy was charged with rounding up the penguins because he's like, let's get the team to get the penguins. And some of the descriptions that I found from the old other members were so hilarious about that. So it's not like I'm making this up. Every detail that might seem like an embellishment is actually coming from a historical source. But I do know that he was the penguin tenderer.
Yeah. And also, it's interesting because you mentioned that Bird never let anyone die on his expeditions. And there were a couple points where it seems like Billy actually saved people's lives because he was such a great swimmer.
Oh, that was so fascinating to me. There was another person on this trip who was the only Jewish person. His name was Benjamin Roth. He was an engineer on the airplanes. He was from the Lower East Side and did not know how to swim. He fell into the ice. Another man named Harrison fell into the ice. And one of the ways that I think he really Billy impressed Bird, was that he didn't even think twice about it. He dove into the waters off the coast of Antarctica when there was ice cracking, an iceberg broke in half. And he helped. I mean, there were other people there. He wasn't the only person, but he was like, there weren't very many. And he was shivering, and it was just amazing. And Bird actually really, really liked him for that. And one of the letters that was probably his most valued possession is a thank you note from Bird saying that he'll never forget that moment. And I thought that was amazing. And none of this I knew, by the way, when I started the book. These were all little joyful discoveries as I was going along with my research.
Yeah. And so it is interesting because, Bird really did like Billy, it seemed. But at the same time, you mentioned this whole who gets picked to winter in Antarctica. It's kind of like Survivor. Billy didn't get picked and ended up going back to New York. And, he was kind of crushed. But at the same time, he went back to New York. He was given a hero's welcome. And
he was used. He actually would go back to Antarctica to pick up the overwintering crew, which not everybody was invited back.
Right.
But Bird saw a different value for him, which was that he was the stowaway. And I was so lucky to obtain his speeches. He was put on WOR Talk Radio in New York, which reached over. There weren't very many radio stations, and they had very wide reaches. So his speech as was advertised. I found the advertisements, and it reached over 1 million people. And he was the first person back from Antarctica that was actually talking about what it was like for the people over at Little America. You could have reporters talking, but here was a member. And he was very wisely used. There were many articles about him in 1929, and then he got to go back and pick them up. But he was giving speeches, and he was sort of the crowd favorite. There were people that were much more famous than him, Bird to begin with. And, of course, they had to put the chief mates and the captains and, the scientists in the news. But especially the New York press, the tabloids loved Billy. And also he started to get picked up in international press. They loved him in Poland and Czechoslovakia. In London, they carried him. But one of the things that was amazing was that they were sort of using his story to create excitement in New Zealand, where they had seen a lot of explorers and they didn't care, but they wanted to have sort of photo ops the way that maybe Trump would want a photo op, right? Yeah. And so they talked about the stowaway before he arrived. And when Billy got off the ship, the supply ship in Dunedin, New Zealand, where I actually went as well for research myself, he was a household name. People were saying, oh my God! And he had no idea how famous he was in the nation of New Zealand. And everywhere he went, people were, and from what my account of this, from what I can make out, he also had quite a great deal of fun with the ladies of New Zealand, because this was also the last stop before they were going to Antarctica.
Yeah.
And he was dying. He didn't have any money because, they were all volunteering. His dad was trying to send him some money, but you didn't really need any money if you were the famous stowaway kid. You could kind of get invited for dinner with the sexy flapper girls of New Zealand.
So, I kind of want to fast forward a bit now. And we talked a bit at the beginning about what happened after. So, that like Billy went back after all this to pick up the people that had been overwintering. They all came back. And then, like you said, they were treated like heroes, but then the Depression hit, and they all kind of had to deal with that. And even the captains, like you said, were stuck in bread lines, looking for work. I mean, what sort of happened to everybody that was on this expedition during that time? I mean, what was it like for them? What was their next chapter?
I think it was humiliating because they had you can't imagine how famous these people were. It's kind of hard to believe now but they're lost to history. But they're the New York Times was the official sponsor. It was paid news coverage, but which Americans didn't know it was paid for. But every single day they were in the news. There was a New York Times reporter on the journey named Russell Owens, who won the Pulitzer Prize for his paid coverage. So people knew every character, but who cares when your family can't, afford a meal? You're going to care about the guys from Antarctica. One thing that Billy was able to do was ask Bird for help, and those letters I found in Ohio State, which his wife had never seen, were really moving and brutal. And his parents started writing letters as well. But he was able to get Bird got him into Columbia University. Can you imagine that application? My summer experience was going to Antarctica with Admiral Byrd, and he wrote his letter of recommendation. He got into Columbia. An immigrant kid from the upholstery business got into Columbia. But even then, the Depression worsened. We think of it as starting in 1929, but a lot of people who know American history know it didn't really, really start to feel like unthinkable until the early 30s with the Dust Bowls hitting. And by then, his family was trying to keep the business, but they lost their business. And even though their son was at Columbia University, he had to leave. He had a little bit of work talking about whales. I mean, some crazy stories that are in the book. But at the end, it was like, where am I going to get some work? And the only way out for him was to go back to sea, because the menial jobs that he had done as a stowaway included being a mess boy, but even worse was being in the coal room, which is really hot. And nobody wants those jobs, even in a depression. And so he found work in the coal rooms, and he got on ships, and then he started to work his way up in commercial ships. And what was amazing was his very quick rise because of his extraordinary experiences at a young age. And one of the things that I'm so amazed about is how quickly he rose from the stowaway to the captain of his own ship. And I think that's really amazing that he was he was a commander. And I think that's the part that I didn't really know when I was starting the story, that it had this real poetic balance. He didn't become an explorer, which was his real passion, but he became a commander. How amazing is that this immigrant who would read books about commanders, no, he wasn't an immigrant, he was first generation, but, his destiny was the upholstery business.
Right. Yeah, I mean, that's interesting. You talk a lot about that right at the end of the book, this whole merchant mariner, which I didn't even really know much about. But yeah, they're very important, and he became a captain on a ship.
In the World War II, the merchant marines were actually commandeered by the American government and they would bring supplies to the soldiers, but they had some of the most dangerous missions. Many people were torpedoed. They were going from Greenland over to Russia, and Billy was leading some of those ships to Murmansk. I mean, you say the word Murmansk to people who are over 90, they just shudder, because there were many, many merchant marines that just died. And he had learned his safety techniques from Byrd, and nobody ever died on his ships. And in talking to his son and his widow, they both said that while the Antarctic experience was a really interesting thing to him and amusing to him, what really defined his life was being in service to the American government during World War II, and really seeing people blown up around him. Being at war defines him more. And his stowaway, I think that his stowaway background was less important to him. And I think that's one of the reasons it also disappeared as a story, because he wasn't promoting himself. He didn't think it was that important. But I think it's important that here is a 17-year-old, the youngest member of the first American expedition to Antarctica, and his story was lost to history. I don't know that he would have ever written an autobiography. It wouldn't even occur to him. He wasn't that type of guy. He was very, very modest. I interviewed some of his first mates from later on when he was a captain that are still alive, and they said they didn't even know he was a stowaway. They started laughing. They were like, what are you talking about? Yeah. I mean, that's how modest he was.
Well, then, lucky for us that you told this story, this incredible story. So just to kind of wrap it up a bit, I mean, we've covered a lot of ground. Is there anything else that you wanted people to know about the book, or any lessons you hope people would get from the book?
Well, I was so delighted that Simon & Schuster included a very large photo spread, which I think actually helps this story as well. It's not, I mean, I hope my writing is nice, but it's lovely to be able to look at some pictures. It reminds you that it is a true story. I think the other thing that I want people to think about is that this was a time of American exceptionalism, and we have forgotten how much we achieved as a nation, that we were leading expeditions to Antarctica. This was the most exciting thing going. It was the great unknown. We were flying over the continent for the first time. People thought there were might be lost people or animals. I mean, the Komodo dragon had just been recently discovered by the West, and there was science magazines saying there might be dinosaurs. You know, it was crazy, and it was like going to the moon. And we have forgotten about the passion that all Americans had for this expedition. Byrd, not Billy, was pretty much, other than Lindbergh, you know, by 1928, I would say Lindbergh was the most famous man in America, but he was his number two on fighting for his turf again. And we have lost that passion. And it didn't matter what your politics were, whether you were Democrat or Republican. Everybody was cheering on American exceptionalism. And we've lost that. There's such a bitter divide in this country. And if only we could have things like, you know, we did have the space race. That's probably the closest that came to this feeling about making it to the moon. And whatever your background, everybody was cheering on the astronauts. And I don't know what's going to be next. Maybe Mars will be the next thing like that.
Further frontiers.
Yes, and I'm actually in the middle of writing an article about the future of stowaways, and maybe I'm going to tackle what it would be like to stow away to Mars.
Ooh. Yeah, I was about to ask you. I mean, what's next? What else are you working on? So you're working on this article?
Well, what I've discovered is that my hunch that this was the kind of book I wanted to write after taking a hiatus from wacky fiction and documentaries was right. This is where I found myself. I took a couple of deep dives into the wrong direction, and I have just loved every minute of writing this. And so I've been talking to my editor about what's next, and I want to stick with narrative nonfiction, and I've discovered another crazy true story that I hope readers will hear about in maybe 2 years, a year or 2 years.
Okay. Exciting.
I think this is it. I think I've really found my milieu. Yeah. I really am very happy. And, you know, I'm also a little bit more seasoned than I was as a younger writer. I'm not thinking that everything's going to change overnight. We're pretty much going to be the same place when, you know, and I think this whole ride myself has been really just fun, because I'm very realistic that at the end of the day, I'm just a writer and I'm telling a story, and I'm lucky to get the readers that I have. And no matter how many articles there are, I mean, that's probably how Billy felt. Like, oh, look, I'm in the paper. You're not famous.
Yeah.
For a time, for a moment, until the next thing comes along. And in the publishing world, it's next month.
Right. It's right away. All right. Well, I'm going to ask I have a thunder round I like to do. It's a couple quick questions to get to know you, then we'll call it a day. So to start off with, what's your favorite food and or drink?
I have a very specific favorite food, which makes me sound like a 96-year-old woman.
No, let's hear it.
I love herring.
Oh.
I love all herring, and I just crave it. And my daughter makes fun of me. She's like, how old are you?
Yeah.
But it's also not just the Jewish style schmaltz herring, but I love the herring that comes from the Netherlands. They call it the new herring, and there's a week in New York where you can get it, and it's amazing.
Just 1 week?
Oh yeah, it's a very specific, NIEW, new herring. It's a very unique herring. It's sort of like getting the wine that comes out for a month. Yeah. You know, it's that kind of herring.
You gotta snag it. Okay. Where is your favorite place you've ever been? Could be Antarctica, but
I have to say that as a documentary maker, I've had the real treat to travel. I've been to the Amazon. I've been to the jungles of New Guinea. But the moment that I actually cried, besides Antarctica's like surreal, but was seeing the Taj Mahal, working on a documentary. This was a paid trip. I just want to let you know, that's one, documentaries don't pay, but at least you get travel.
Your travel's covered, yeah.
But I was in front of the Taj Mahal, and I actually started crying, and that was the most beautiful place I've ever seen in my life. And also the story. I'm a real sucker for story, as you could tell, and the great romantic story that this was built for his lover that was never going to see it just got me as well.
Yeah. So if you could wave a magic wand and change any one thing, what would it be and why?
I think that I've been thinking about this a lot. It's funny when we look at our social media posts, Facebook prompts you with what happened 8 years ago or 9 years ago. I remember how happy we were as Americans, not happy, but that we were more innocent. And there's so much international turmoil right now. And I think that might be the way that people felt in the 30s looking back on the 20s. Things that bother me, I'm just look, I just want to have a safe country for my daughter to grow up in. I don't want nuclear war.
Yeah.
And I think if I could wave a magic wand, it would be to take away the political strife that we have in the United States right now.
Great. I think many, many people would agree with you. So hopefully we'll get there and return back.
To accept just a feeling of what would be amazing to me is if Americans were again reaching for these great goals of joint exceptionalism, like going to the unknown continent of Antarctica, like reaching the moon. Because imagine if we could put our passions to science and experience instead of hating each other.
Yeah. And on that note, Laurie, it has been a pleasure to speak with you.
Thank you, John.
This is Laurie Gwen Shapiro. Her book, The Stowaway. It is, as you've heard, an amazing book with a gripping story. I heartily recommend it. And thanks again for being on the show.
Thank you for having me here.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode of Read, Learn, Live. If you liked it, tell a friend and subscribe on iTunes and Google Play. If you hated it, tell a friend and subscribe on iTunes and Google Play. And so it goes.